New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman is taking aim at banks that misuse databases to prevent some people from opening checking accounts. Banks have effectively blacklisted more than 1 million Americans because they overdrew their account or bounced a check. These vast databases were intended to screen out people who commit serial fraud, but its misuse is harming those who made mistakes years ago, which have been corrected in many, many cases. Without access to a checking account, these consumers must rely on costly alternatives such as check cashing businesses or basic financial services. Kyle Harrington is a financial expert and a founding and managing partner at Harrington Capital Management, and he joins us here in our New York studio. Hey, Kyle, it's good to see you.
Great to see you again.
So this database, it's called Check Systems,
right.
And it has amassed just huge amount of information, but it's meant for banks to be able to catch individuals who are committing fraud.
Right.
Turns out now that banks, though, big ones like Bank of America, right. JP Morgan Chase, are using them to weed out customers that have, done what we might consider to be minor things in their past.
I think it's minor. I think the intent of the system was for bank fraud. The fact that they're going down the path of someone having bounced checks, whether it be college kids or whomever, I think that people need a pass, and I don't think that that's a good mechanism to discriminate folks from later opening up an account at other banks. I think that's a little bit invasive. Everybody makes mistakes. That's a lot different than fraud.
Yeah, it is a little bit invasive, and some might even make the case that it's a bit discriminatory because of the groups of individuals that this most likely impacts.
I think you're right, and I think that we've all, there's a lot of people that have bounced checks. They don't calculate exactly their balances. I'm not sure that in any way this is a good way to, weed out who people committing fraud versus people bouncing checks.
And of course, being more specific, these groups are often young people
exactly.
who are not financially responsible in many ways, and then lower income workers as well. Let me ask you this: have banks been doing this for a long time, and we're just now finding about it?
I've heard about this, years back. But I think now it's coming to light, and I think people have made a stink about it. I know Capital One, for example, has investigated how they're handling the system and if they've overreached their boundaries in terms of what we just talked about. And I think that they've come to the conclusion that maybe they're going to alter the system back to figuring out ways to catch fraudsters, call them, versus just people that are bouncing checks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman sent out letters to banks with an inquiry about this practice, and Capital One was at least the only bank that I've been able to find that said, oh, you might be right about this, we're going to review.
Yeah, the research that I did was Capital One, I applaud Capital One for taking a step back and investigating their system and whether or not it's the right system, and I think that they're going to come to the conclusion that we're talking about, which is it's a little bit invasive and a little much.
It seems a little bit counterintuitive, because if someone is being denied a bank account because they bounced maybe 1 or 2 checks 5 years ago, it seems a little counterintuitive to me, because banks make money off of us bouncing checks.
That's the other thing. You see the $25, $35 fees when people bounce checks, and that's definitely a revenue stream for a lot of these banks, and those they add up, right? And so it does seem a little bit counterintuitive. But I think what's happened here is we had the 2008 crash. There's been a lot more cyber security issues that have arisen, and so banks are, I think, the pendulum is swinging toward being overreaching and a little bit more, more over-regulated.
And as I understand in the research that our producer provided to me, that 10 million people in the U.S. do not have a bank account.
That's the other thing. People have. I have talked to people who think that the fees, are a bit egregious in bouncing checks. But then I've also talked to people that have said, they collect my data and they do things with my data that I don't necessarily like to do. So there are people, and you just mentioned how many millions that don't have checking accounts.
And what does that mean, Kyle? What does that mean to our society, to our economy, when so many people don't have bank accounts?
Well, think about it. Right, you're right. You bring up a great point. There's opportunity cost to the banks for those people having their capital on the sidelines. They're not investing that money maybe in CDs. They're not utilizing the check writing system of the banks, and they're not facilitating, business. And so there is definitely opportunity cost to that money.
Is there a recourse for young people particularly, or anybody who bounces a check early on in their financial career and then faces this? Is there something they can do maybe to either avoid this experience?
Well, I think one of the things that Capital One is investigating is having when you're opening a checking account, investigating the background a little bit to understand whether or not people have maybe bounced checks in the past, okay? And then having an explanation around that. I think that that's a process, and people should understand and be open about what happened in the past. That's a lot better than saying, you know what, you bounced a check and you no longer can open a checking account.
Right.
That's just egregious.
Do you have any idea how far back this database goes? Because if you bounced a check 10 years ago, would it be swept up in this, mining?
They're saying they're looking back 7 to 10 years
Wow.
in terms of whether or not you bounced the check. So there's some history there, and going back, I think they're going back 10 years. So
That's
we've all
incredible.
had a mishap, and I don't think you should, be held accountable for that, and not being able to open a bank account at another bank.
Yeah, and gosh, do credit reporting companies keep your information for that long, or longer?
No, they keep it for longer.
For longer than that?
It's a 10-year process where they keep your information based on, a whole bunch of things. But, you're talking about kind of the Experians of the world. And
Right.
I hear it's 10 years.
It's 10 years, so it's almost as long as that. And when you bounce a check and to think that that's going to follow you for 10 years, that's absolutely
I think it's
incredible.
too much.
Yeah, it is. It is. It does seem. Well, let me ask you about this. So when an individual does go to open a bank account, and let's
Right.
say they make it through the process, they're allowed to. Well, the bank offers all these products.
Right.
And one of them are these protections
Right.
against your account overdrawing. So does something like this make a product like that worth it?
Well, that's a very good point, and I think you're right. I mean, the banks can earn fees, and they do earn fees on called overdrawn protection. So if you do write checks that are up and above the balances, the banks will make a fee and cover you up to a certain amount based on your history, and I think that that's fine. But again, to eliminate someone from opening up a checking account, which is very necessary in today's world, seems egregious.
Is this something that then federal regulators will have to step in to correct this practice, or just banks policing themselves?
I think banks policing themselves will come to an understanding. If that doesn't work and it becomes a bigger problem, then I think it becomes a federal issue.
All right, this is good information to know. Kyle Harrington, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you. You're watching Arise America.